Ahead and get to sharing my screen here and get rolling. I think I'll just do this. And then you guys can probably just, actually, I'm going to share the other screen. All right, does that work? You guys see the regular version?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I think I'm not sure if Heather already jumped off, but I'm gonna try to keep make sure that people get admitted as well as go. So if anybody sees anything in the chat, feel free to unmute or and say it out loud just because I'm trying to do everything today. So all right, hopefully you're here to see December real estate update as always. Um, we are gonna, you guys, most of you know who I am, so I'm not gonna go into that. But as always, we're going to start with kind of the uh, like talk about interest rates, kind of like what we did last month, although we have a few different slides in here. Then we'll jump into inventory and selling trends nationally, and then jump into Central Ohio, just for those of you that may not be from Central Ohio, so that you don't have to look at that stuff if you don't want to. One thing I'm going to have more on for you guys next month is there are definitely some lending changes happening. Nothing like super crazy from the perspective that you need to worry about it, but more so just from the perspective of especially, well, whether you're working with buyers or sellers to understand. Um, a spoiler alert is that there's going to be appraisal waivers down to 10% down starting soon, if not already. And so the reason why that's significant is because obviously there's going to be more buyers that are going to qualify for appraisal waivers. But understanding what all of that stuff means to you if you're representing the buyer. And then also, I learned on the call this morning that if you're a low income borrower, and you're doing a conventional mortgage, that you can actually qualify for an appraisal waiver all the way with as little as 3% down. Um, However, the caveat to that is that, as from what I heard, I have not verified any of this, but Fannie Mae requires you to upload a copy of the inspection report if you get that appraisal waiver. And so those are just some examples. Most of the changes, to my understanding, are around appraisals. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation to have. So I might even try to have a special like lender guest that knows underwriting guidelines really well, because it's just a super interesting thing. And I think especially if interest rates go down and we get back into more of a competitive market, it could definitely be something as we go into spring that you guys need to be aware of. Um, Obviously, interest rates, for those of you who are active in the market, have continued to be something that essentially has been driving the market, um, both from a demand perspective as well as, well, the demand perspective, and then that leads into certainly, prices, how many price reductions or not people have to do and different things. But as you can see here, if you haven't been paying attention to interest rates, we saw that really nice drop kind of happening all the way back from May to the basically middle of September. And then things shot back up again. And then post election, they started coming back down. And then last week and the week before, we kind of gave back a lot of those gains. or improvements, I should say. And now most lenders are kind of quoting somewhere in the middle sixes to upper sixes, depending on where you're at in the country and what type of loan product you're looking at. I have seen if you have an interest rate sensitive buyer, which obviously everybody is to some degree, but especially people on the lower end that truly like can't afford to go up in price. There has been a lot of variation between lenders lately. And so it's something to keep in mind. I know as agents, sometimes, you've referred somebody to a lender that like, and trust. But on the flip side, if moving lenders allows them to qualify for the house that they want, it's definitely something to make a few phone calls. And I'm going to use these couple rate sheets. First of all, the reason I showed these rate sheets last week and I kept them in here last month and kept them in here this month was really because if we go back here and look, the average interest rate according to Mortgage News Daily is just under 7% nationally. But you can see Equitable Mortgage right now is showing something in the mid sixes for conventional, but then also keep in mind FHA and VA are usually about 0.5% to 0.75% lower. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that whenever you're getting quoted rates that you're always paying attention to points as well, because a lot of lenders are playing around with points and advertising lower rates, even though they cost your buyer money. And a low rate, even though it makes the buyer feel good, doesn't always make sense, especially if you think that rates are going to go down over the next year. And then this is a newer lender in town, Tithe Lending. They send out a really good weekly report on rates, but look at their rates. Significantly better than most that I've seen. But I also like this feature here of last week versus this week, just to show us the trends of where they were. But I put these guys in here too, just to say that like, I mean, that's, almost a 0.5 point difference. And I've seen lenders with even higher rates than what Equitable is usually pretty solid. So I show all of this just to say that there's a lot of variation. And again, remember as an agent, you have a fiduciary to your client, not the lender. And so just make sure that if you have rate sensitive buyers that they're looking at least you're calling on their behalf a couple other lenders. And these are all top tier too, so keep that in mind. I mean, usually you're up to a 780 credit score in order to get these best rates. So just keep that stuff in mind. All right, I started off talking about the impact of rates on demand. And the easiest way to look at that is definitely mortgage application data. Usually this is lagging a little bit behind. So this spike probably happened to go back here, back when all of these rates started dropping. We saw this corresponding spike in purchases. And then obviously now we'll probably see another drop in that. But just showing you in relation to where we were during the pandemic, and you can kind of understand why there are fewer sales happening, right? Because there's just way fewer people in the market due to the higher rates. Um, Obviously, I was in an interest rate kind of mood today when I put these together. So I just thought this is interesting stuff to understand. Refinances accounted for somewhere around 40% of mortgage applications in the last week of November. That jumped up when rates bumped down a little bit, and then I would expect that that'll reverse trend now that they've bumped back up. But FHA accounts for about 16% of all mortgage applications, and VA accounts for somewhere between 12 and 13. So always interesting. This is one thing that I've been hearing a lot of buzz about. I haven't seen many lenders advertising it, but I've seen a couple people say this, and then I saw this in Mortgage News Daily, so I thought I'd point it out. Look at that 5/1 ARM rate. So for the longest time, adjustable rate mortgages were like pretty much the same as the 30-year fixed, so it made no sense to even consider it. But look at that 5/1 ARM rate. I mean, if you can get a mortgage in the in like around 5.75 to 6% versus a 30-year fixed of mid to high sixes. I mean, that can, depending on your purchase price, that can make a pretty significant difference. So again, back to ways that you can use this today. If you have a rate sensitive buyer, I think the chances of interest rates staying the same or dropping over the next 5 years is pretty solid. And so if your buyer can get a rate that's fixed for 5 years at a, 3/4 to 1% lower rate, it's going to make a pretty significant difference on their payment and offer them definitely a lot more, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Safety than like a 2-1 buy down where realistically the chances of rates going down significantly in the next year or two is definitely lower than over the next 5 years. So is everybody getting that? Am I losing anybody? Anybody have questions before I move on to the next topic? I know that was a lot of like mortgage geeking out, but good. Okay. All right. This is thanks to Joel. I think I saw him on here. Joel, are you on here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So Joel proactively reached out to me and asked for a topic. So here it is. So all of you can do the same. Um, but basically, what he asked, he said, and Joel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in a nutshell, he has a client who is in contract on a new build, I believe, that's done in February, which I think a lot of new construction gets completed in the first quarter of the year. And he wanted to know when's the best time to list their house for sale in order to maximize value, which is an awesome question, and I think it's a great exercise. So um, basically, I just created this front page here. So what I like to look at is I'm going to first look at the seasonal trend, not first, so that's really the whole conversation, is looking at seasonal trends. So we're looking for the highest number of pendings or showing activity, and then the lowest number of new listings and active listings, because our goal, if we're representing the seller, is always to list the house when we have the most amount of buyers but the least amount of competition, right? And so we're going to look at these trends. I'm going to use trend graphics because that's what we have at our office. But then also the showings data information, which you guys know that we track internally on our team, and then I share it with you guys every month. Um, but the one thing to remember too, and which I've done for you, Joel, so thank you again for the topic, is we can look at overall data in the market, but price range and area definitely impact trends, right? And so just because Central Ohio is moving in a specific direction doesn't always mean that price range and area are always moving in that same direction. So there's a lot going on this graph. And so I'll try to walk through it. If there's any confusion or questions around it, please interrupt me because again, I may not. So the way that we're going to look at the gap between pendings and new listings is the red line are the pendings and the blue line are the number of new listings. And this is obviously over the course of a whole month. So we can use the showing data, which I will in a second, to look at like week by week when the best week is. But again, too, remember this is historical. So this isn't taking into account the interest rates, for example, which could have a short-term impact. But I think from a overall trend perspective, this gives you a pretty good idea. So you can see that the gap between the new listings and the pendings, and this is using earlier this year as an example, essentially stays the same from January all the way through March when we look at month by month. And then when we get to April, you see that gap widen, and then May widens even more. So what that's telling us is that essentially February to March is going to be where you see the largest increase in buyers with essentially no correlating increase in new listings. So if I'm looking at this to answer Joel's question generally, I would say that the best time to get on the market as a seller is going to be by the end of March. As soon as we move into April, we start to see more sellers entering the market than buyers entering the market. And then once we get to May, we're really seeing a significant increase in the number of new listings compared to the number of properties actually going into contract. Now, one thing that did happen this year, in fairness to this chart, is that also interest rates started going up in the spring this year, which is not something that had happened before. So we definitely saw like a more pronounced flatlining of buyer activity. But the other thing I want you to notice, because this is important, um, the when you start to see this gap between new listings and pendings, you can guarantee that a month or two later, you're going to see a higher increase in active listings, right? And so you guys see that it basically, I mean, it very quickly becomes apparent that the higher the bigger this gap, the more these things grow. As the gap starts to close, you can see the number of active listings starts to fall. I know if you're a data nerd, it probably makes complete sense, but if you're not, you want to recognize that correlation. So obviously this works in the inverse if you're a buyer though, right? So you really you do have the most competition here in May as a buyer, but also look at what happens after June. You actually start to drop off the number of pendings, but the number of new listings stay relatively high, and then your active number of active properties actually continues to increase here, and the number of pendings continued to decrease. And so that's why, again, not every area showed this, but that's why we started to see properties sitting on the market a lot longer. So if you're a buyer, you actually, I always say like the month of July is one of the best months to shop for houses, in my opinion, because there's the most on the market and buyers go on vacation. And so competition decreases. But I would say, I always say list by the middle of June. Always list by the middle of June. Once you get close to the weekend before 4th of July, and then 4th of July through the start of school is always the slowest time of the spring summer market. Then once everybody goes back to school after Labor Day, start to see things pop usually. Now this year's a little bit of an exception because of the election. I think we saw a protracted slowdown, and then we actually saw a little bit of a pop after the election. So I went through a lot here. Anybody have questions, comments? You want to tell me I'm full of crap? I would love that. I would love to have a debate about this if anybody has any input on this graph before I move on to the next one. No, no one? Come on. All right. Here's showings. So this is what we usually go over at the end, but this is an even better indication of activity than pendings because sometimes pendings are held over with new construction. So you can see 2022 was when we had the huge like kind of crash, for lack of a better way to describe it, where interest rates were really good in the spring and or in the early, and let's say in the winter and early spring, and then they started rising, but buyers were kind of rushing into the market in order to take advantage of the rates. And then everything kind of died off and really went into the cycle that we've been in for now the last 2 full years. But again, if we're looking at what's the best time to list, so definitely jokingly, but not jokingly, never list on Easter weekend is what our showing data tells us, right? But pretty consistently, the highest number of showings have been following either the weekend before or the weekend after Easter. And then really look at the showing trends, it pretty much drops off for the rest of the year. So definitely your peak and buyer showings, at least every year, is right around Easter, which is, that like somewhere between the end of March, just like we saw in the pendings data, and the end of April. I don't remember exactly how Easter is figured out, but I think it always falls in that range. And so if you're peaking going into the end of March, my advice would be sometime in the month of March is probably going to be typically the greatest number of buyers with the least amount of competition. Once you move into April, you are competing with more new listings and you're really not seeing more new buyers. I think the reason why we see spikes a lot of times and why the weekend after Easter is because we're kind of stealing. People aren't going on Sunday, but they're going on Monday or Tuesday. Because I think when we look at weeks, we go Monday through Sunday. So we're probably seeing some of those showings moving from Easter weekend to the following weekend. All right, so then we're going to look at a generic example of, although Joel, you said this was kind of like around where you're at, so I just used some estimates on pricing. But look at Hilliard over 500,000, Hilliard schools over 500. So remember that graph at all of Central Ohio. Look how different this is. So when we moved earlier this year, we actually had an inversion, we can call it, of the new listings and pendings, meaning there were more pendings actually happening than new listings, right? And so what does that correlate to? If there's more buyers and there are new listings, then active listings are actually going down. So when we looked at the overall market, active listings were starting to rise. But when we looked at Hilliard over 500,000, because there were more buyers in the market than new sellers, we actually saw active listings going down. But interestingly enough, it still essentially resulted, maybe 1 month lag, but essentially still resulted in the same conclusion. So basically, new listings skyrocketed between March and April. And so because of that, the inversion was no more and competition was much higher. And so then you started to see the actives start to build after that. And so again, the conclusion here, even though the numbers are different and maybe January and February become a little bit more in the conversation, ultimately, still my conclusion here would be the best month to list is going to be March. If you want the most buyers in the market with the lowest amount of competition, it's still March. So that's the end of that piece. Joel, what did I leave questions remaining on?
No, you hit it like perfectly. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun. I love it. And if you guys ever have those situations, it makes it, I think people understand it much better when you can use real life examples. So anybody else have questions? No question is a dumb question. If this was completely over your head and you have a really basic one, please.
Hey, Troy, it's Nathan. Just a quick question about like where do you pull most of these stats? I saw that you did it in showing time for one of them. Is the other ones through MLS, or how do we pull these so that we have specific charts for our clients?
Yeah, so all of these graphs are from Trend Graphics, which we have access through to from the office. So if you want, just go to kwcresources.com and you can get that login information. Um, and then, yeah, it'll be pretty self-explanatory. It's a pretty easy system to navigate. You just put in your criteria and then it comes up with these graphs. The showing time stuff, we pull it all from showing time, but I have between Allison and our virtual assistant, we pull all of this by hand and put it into these graphs. So I would say every month I go over this. So if you want like completely updated to yesterday stuff, then you'll have to do it. But if these general trends are okay, every month you can just join us here on the webinar and I'll give it to you without having to do the work.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. This is jumping into national stats really quickly, which I would say are more irrelevant than ever right now, just because there's so much variation in the different regions within the US. But what it is most valuable for, kind of like the Central Ohio versus Hilliard, is really just looking at the trends. So you can see active listings up 26% compared to last November. We're kind of right in the middle of active listings between like the COVID pandemic period and then pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. Obviously, you know, we've been seeing the inventory slowly rise, and what we haven't seen is that usually pre-pandemic, you know, the inventory rises were kind of started, or the inventory levels started decreasing in August. You can see during the pandemic that has not been the case. Well, I should say post-pandemic, so 22 and 23, really inventory was not peaking until November. And so we'll see if that continues, but it looks like the trend is at least flattening out, still not decreasing. New listings was up 2% in November compared to last year, which in my opinion is relatively insignificant. You can see we're still well below pre-pandemic levels and pandemic. Really, we're just kind of in this no man's land of post-pandemic. And most importantly, outside of the pandemic, it's interest rates, right? Like sellers are just not listing their house because they want interest rates to be lower. And there's most people that I listen to, although they're always wrong, so who knows? But I think interest rates at 6% or less, so most importantly, if we can get a 5 in front of the average 30-year fixed, I think we will see new listings start to bump back towards pre-pandemic levels. Pending sales are actually the highest they've been outside of the 2020 and 2021 years over the last, what is that, 7 years. So that's a good thing. That means sales should continue trending up, even though it's not super significant. They definitely have trended up this year compared to the last couple years. Days on market are also continuing to trend up in terms of that average. Um, that being said, it's still, I don't think, a huge impact, but certainly we are trending. And that kind of goes in line with the inventory. As inventory levels rise, days on market tend to rise. Realtor.com does not publish at least the median or average sold price. So we will look at that for Columbus when we jump into the Columbus numbers, but I don't have anything other than the median list price. And the list price is pretty flat. It's 0.7% lower, but in my opinion, pretty statistically insignificant. You can see the last 3 years, it's pretty much been in the same spot. So that's no major change there. And actually, most people that I listen to are pretty shocked that we've kept prices where we have in spite of the increase in inventory, because historically, an increase in inventory to this level that we've seen, you know, up 27%, actually here locally, our numbers for the middle of December compared to last year, it's up 50%. And we just have not seen any kind of decrease in pricing. Actually, we've continued to see increases in pricing, so that's interesting. And then price reduced share. So when interest rates shot up, we saw a bunch of price reductions. I think that's part of the reason why the list price has stayed pretty even, is because sellers are becoming more and more realistic with the market, probably due to you guys who are educating them on the fact that the market isn't what it was 2 years ago, and therefore we're seeing fewer price reductions. Now, one other thing that I've been seeing, and I've also been hearing as well in other markets, is, you know, it's not, even though it can be a little bit stressful for sellers, especially if they thought that their house was going to sell right away, doing price reductions every single week isn't necessarily necessary in order to get a house sold. Sometimes it just takes a couple weeks. And a lot of times when when you do kind of stand firm on price, you'll still sell not far off of list price. That's not like an always thing, but we're in a very weird environment right now where stuff will sit on the market for longer periods of time than we've seen in a while and still get good offers because the buyer really wants the place for whatever reason. So, anyways, we're seeing price reduced kind of like in the middle where it normally is, for lack of a better way to say it. Regional statistics. Uh, I think these are always interesting to look at. They unfortunately quit publishing the like now versus pre-pandemic, which I thought was really the most interesting data. They still do have it down here for Columbus, but for some reason it's all the way, their most recent data is from September. Um, so again, not as interesting by any means in my opinion, but you can see the number of active listings year over year. The South and West definitely have more than the Northeast and Midwest. Um, the South had a couple major hurricanes this year, so that's something too that I'm from reading. Like you kind of have to take these big numbers with a grain of salt, but definitely things have slowed down in the South and West much more compared to Midwest and Northeast. Northeast is still on fire. I mean, they're definitely the best region. All right, I'm gonna go into Central Ohio here in just a second. Does anybody have any questions on anything we've went over so far before we jump in? No? You guys aren't very participatory today, but I'm gonna have to start calling people out. But anyways, I won't do that yet. All right, so local market, November year over year numbers. So inventory was up 25% year over year. In November, new listings were actually down 3.8%. I did not go back and look, but I think this might be the first month of the year that year over year new listings have been down because I think we've been adding. So normally when that happens, we should see in the next month or two the active inventory start to decrease as long as the pendings still stay. We kind of beat this graph to death, I think, earlier in the thing. So looking at resale changes from November to November, we just went over those numbers, but you can see, and I think I have another slide. I think the next slide is coming up, but you can see that the month to date numbers for December are pretty crazy. So we'll jump over. New construction is all red, but again, new construction, we work from such a small sample size that it's not super significant. I think from talking to builder reps, most of the builders are continuing to put holes in the ground. They're still, expecting pretty good activity moving into next year. That being said, I think they might be a little bit more cautious just with the rates being higher, but most of the builders are offering pretty good rate incentives too. So again, if you have price or interest rate sensitive buyers, and you haven't checked out new construction, definitely would encourage that. Yeah, here's the resale. So look at this compared to December 15th last year. The active inventory is up 49.9%. So that's an interesting number that we'll have to keep an eye on. One of the things that started to change post-pandemic, and again, I don't know if it's just because the market's been so weird with interest rates and everything, but back pre-pandemic, people that didn't sell their house by November would just take it off the market. And I definitely think that we've started to see people leave their house on the market a little bit longer into the holidays. And I don't know if that's just because people were expecting it to sell quickly and moved and don't have a choice, or what the reason for that is, but this is something that we'll definitely want to keep an eye on. The rest of these numbers, as I talk about, like in the month comparisons, are always a little bit sketchy just because, for example, the 15th this month or this year fell on Sunday. And so was it Friday last year or Saturday? I'm not sure, but those impact more. This is kind of some interesting stuff too. This is the first time since last January that the sales price has been down to 96% of the original list price. So that's pre any price reductions. And then we also saw average days on market go up to 27, which again was only 1 day higher than last year. Um, so yeah, just remember, obviously these are closed units, so these are places that went into contract 1 to 2 months ago, usually, sometimes 3, so keep that in mind. Resale months of supply, it's the highest that we've been since 2018, which is still funny because balanced market is considered 4 to 6 months of inventory. But obviously, you can see really since April, the trend has been up. Um, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens if we continue to see inventory rise. Uh, and I don't know, I might have screwed up and not deleted an old slide. All right, another interesting thing, at least I thought it was interesting. I've been talking about this for a couple months, but when we look at average sales price, we continue to see the gap between list price and sales price shrink. Um, so for instance, from October to November, the average list price dropped by 7,000, but the average sales price only dropped by 5,000. Um, and so we're definitely continuing to see the gap. You can see also last year from October to November, prices dropped by 7,000 on average. This year from October to November, they only dropped by 5. So again, I'm expecting, just based on kind of the strength of the sold price, that we're probably going to continue to see price appreciation moving into next year, although the rate could slow down a little bit just because of demand. But I think if interest rates were to go down significantly, it could change everything. This is another way we've been looking at showings, just compared to the interest rates. We haven't seen, I think there's so many variables that go into this, it's hard to see the exact correlation. So I don't get too excited about that one anymore. I had high hopes for this graph, but it didn't turn out to be as exciting as I thought. And then this is the one that we went over earlier. And then last but certainly not least, rental prices. Nothing super exciting here. We stayed higher for longer, technically. I would say, as someone who has a couple rentals, and then actually, I've started a property management company, so a shameless plug if you have any clients that are looking for a property manager. But we've definitely seen typical fall demand drop off in the rental market for sure. So number of showings have been down. And again, I think that's another place where if you have a rental on the market, you kind of have to just stand firm on price, because I don't know that dropping $100 really creates extra demand, but it costs you $1,200 over the course of the next year. And so it could be a situation, where you just wait until January and see if there's kind of that typical increase in demand that we see, through the January, February, March timeframe. So anyways, yeah, that's what I've got. And then last but not least, I guess this is truly the last. Please type your email in the chat, and Allison can add you to like our little calendar invite. And then also we can get the slide deck out to you too. So you guys have it. You're welcome to use it. I don't think any of it's branded. So you guys are welcome to use it in listing presentations or however you see fit. And then sources, like I said, Trend Graphics, Realtor.com, Mortgage News Daily for all the mortgage stuff, and then Zillow. All right, cool. Well, that's all I've got in terms of slides. Does anybody else have anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to go over, or anything that we did go over that you had more questions on?
Troy, I got one for you.
Yeah.
Okay, I know you hit on this briefly, but what's your opinion on sellers leaving their homes on the market, in the next 30 days? Do you have conversations with maybe pulling it for a month, or do you suggest leaving them on there?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the seller's situation. Like I said, I think that unfortunately for a lot of sellers, we've got vacant properties or sellers that are already, in contract that maybe aren't selling as quickly as they thought. And so, I mean, I think it definitely needs to be a conversation. Um, However, on the flip side, I still do think that with the election ending, and it's not a political statement by any means. It happens after every election, no matter who wins, is people that maybe were putting their lives on hold for whatever reason, realize that whether they're happy or sad about who won, their life has to go on, and that they're not going to sit in a hole for the next 4 years. And so I do think we're going to see a pop. We saw a small pop in activity post-election, but I think post holidays we'll probably see, I wouldn't be surprised to see a much stronger than average January, especially if the weather isn't super cold. As crazy as it is, the weather definitely plays a part too. And so I would just be careful if they have to sell of missing that pop because it's really hard to predict. And then obviously you also have the interest rate conversation. Now, if somebody's living in it and they haven't bought anything else, I would strongly consider pulling it off the market for 30 days in order to reset days on market, um, and just get kind of a new entry into the market for sure. I probably in a perfect world would have done that 2 weeks ago. Um, but now that you're here, if activity's been super, super low and they don't really want to do a price reduction, I would consider doing that. If you're not going to do it because you don't want to be off for 30 days, I would put a strategy together. I think with the way Christmas and New Year's falls this year, that there's a decent chance that the weekend after New Year's for sure could be a busy one. Um, because people are going to be definitely like over the holiday thing, and still most people are going to be off work, I would assume Thursday, well, definitely Thursday. Well, not definitely Thursday, but Thursday and Friday, I think there's a decent chance that people are going to be available and looking for something to do, and you could see a pop.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, does anybody else disagree? We've got a lot of good agents on here that have experience with that stuff. What would you guys Andrea, your camera's on, which I don't want to discourage cameras, but
Thanks a
what
lot.
what would your kitchen looks sweet though.
Oh,
So
thanks.
what are you telling sellers in that
Oh.
situation? Like, what are your thoughts?
I've got sellers that I've got two listings that are about to hit the market and two listings that are active right now, and it's extremely slow. And it
Hmm.
does make me a little nervous to take on these listings right now. So I don't know. I don't know where I stand with this right now. It's definitely extremely weird, it feels. And so it was good to hear you kind of say the same thing. I'm like, glad it's not just me feeling that
Yeah,
way.
no, and I think too, if you guys aren't using showing time, and the showing reports, which is where we pull those numbers to go onto the graph, you can really zero in and kind of figure out what your competition is getting, and then also give your seller, that guarantee. It's one thing to tell them that it's slow, but it's another thing to show them with raw data. Then it's not your opinion. And I think when you can show them that, it really takes a lot of that pressure off of you as the agent and makes it more about the market. I think Diana Kokoska is famous for saying we don't make the market, we interpret the market, right? And I think that at the end of the day, you have to be really careful, especially in this. I mean, I think the last year and a half has been, in my 20 years in real estate, it's been the hardest time to be a listing agent because there's been the trends have been so quickly changing, from interest rates to the election to rising inventory. And so it's been really difficult, and you don't want to be owning, like, it's okay to give your opinion, but you want it to be based in fact. And it's okay to say, like, I don't know, like, this is my best educated guess, but that we don't control the market. And so I think, for anybody out there that needs to have that conversation, that's something that the best way that you position yourself is to give them all the facts and show that, hey, we know what we're doing, we know what the market is, but we also don't have a crystal ball. And so at the end of the day, I always say my job is to present the information and you have the hard one, and it's to make the decision. And so I would definitely be very careful about owning the decision, because then it becomes your fault when that doesn't happen and none of you control that. So what else? Who else? Anybody else have any questions? Comments? No? All right. Well, we can end early. You guys can have 12 minutes of your life back that you weren't expecting, because I'm rarely early. So thank you guys all for showing up in a month, in a busy month. And if there's anything I can do, for those of you guys that put your emails in, I'll have Allison get those out. If you didn't or forget Troy at marshhomegroup.com, you can always email me and she'll send it from there too. So thank you guys for coming. Have an amazing Christmas, happy holidays, happy New Year, and I'll see you in January.
Thanks, Troy.
Bye, guys.